Hi, I'm Katie Green.
I am Dan Green, and welcome back to the Green Hair Podcast.
Today we have with us Bill Buppert from ZeroGov.com and author of the new book, which is called Limited Governments, Unicorns, and Other Mythological Creatures. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Good morning. It's great to talk to my new friends in Scotland.
Exactly. I think it's really exciting. You're at the other end of the world, but we're actually talking to each other now. And
Indeed.
It's actually pretty amazing.
Yeah, Bill, so to start off, why don't you give us a bit of your background so our audience can kind of, if they're not familiar with you, they can get a feel for your background and where you've sort of come from?
Certainly, I'm a former serving and retired Army officer from the U.S. Army. And since that time, I retired in 2003. I took 4 years off, and then I returned to the workforce to my peculiar skill set after that time. But for the past 2 decades, I have been wrestling with my philosophical growth and road and journey into libertarianism and eventually into what I refer to as abolitionism. I use the term abolitionism because anarchism, which means not without rules, but without rulers, it makes people feel their pants in America. It tends to have a lot of political and historical baggage attached to it that has a lot of negativity. So I've taken to referring to myself as an abolitionist, to which people will say, if they know what that is, they'll say, oh, you're opposed to slavery. And my response is usually, yes, I am. What parts of slavery do you support?
Yeah, exactly.
Because obviously, if they're minarchist and limited government or maximum government, they adhere to that philosophy, then that would mean that there is a portion of slavery they approve of.
Yeah, so there is still a fraction of that happening. Anyway, and it's interesting you say that, like, when we're talking about kind of labels and stuff, it's very easy to get lost in that. You can call yourself many things, I'm sure. But I sort of refer to myself now as more of a voluntarist. I was calling myself an anarchist, and then people were looking at me really funny and stuff, so I sort of had to move on from there. But I know Dan wanted to jump in here. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say I agree, because anarchism has just become too charged a term. You know, people sort of think if you say I'm an anarchist, you're like on the street throwing petrol bombs at people, you know?
Exactly, especially there in the UK.
Oh yeah, it's happening. It's happening over here. It's happening obviously in the States. We know that there are things happening in Ferguson right now. And we know that rioting and looting can happen from all different things. But we're not going to go too far into that. I think it's maybe there's so many tangents.
It's horrific what's happening in Ferguson, but Ferguson, Missouri in the United States is simply a microcosm of the horrific state of being that American policing has become.
Yeah.
It's become militarized. It's become violence prone. We have a tremendous amount of above ground police brutality here in the United States.
Yeah.
I would suggest also that there's a tremendous amount of underreporting and non-reporting. And we also have the highest per capita incarceration rate, if not raw data and numbers, of people in cages from the local to the federal level. And one of the big police brutality mysteries in America is just how bad is it as far as violence against these caged people inside those walls that don't have cameras or cell phones or video recording.
It's quite scary to think about that. And I know I can't comment far too much about the Ferguson thing. I'm not well educated enough, I'll be perfectly honest. I do live here, even though it's all over Twitter and it's all over the internet and it's happening. But I know in the UK we are starting to have a bit more of a police state here. Our policemen are armed, even though guns are still illegal to the general public here. But I'm gonna let Dan jump in. He wants to.
Oh, that's been a kind of recent thing, just in Scotland particularly, because you had different police forces in Scotland, and then they united into one single force. And there's been all these reports about how armed officers have jumped up. You're more likely to get stopped and searched in Scotland than you are in New York now. It's really escalating here as well.
It's pretty horrific, Dan, because once cops are militarized, once they wear that universal color of death, which is black, once they've got the buzz cuts and the jack boots, and they've got these weapons of war, they will behave in the appropriate fashion with the weapons of war, be incentivized in their behavior. And what we have here in America is we have what I call this evil trifecta when it comes to police brutality, where with police unions, qualified immunity, and our very curious notion of officer safety, which you see the results of in Ferguson, Missouri, They literally have a license to kill, much like your famed James Bond 007.
I was just imagining Dan as 007 is quite frightening.
Weird. But like
Green,
yeah.
Daniel Green.
But no, that's the thing, because I think the thing is that a lot of it's hard to explain to like a police officer that they don't have any power. Their uniform has power, and all that uniform is simply an extension of the state. But you know, they like to. I think a lot of policemen that I knew of seemed to be people who enjoyed telling people what to do and felt pretty powerless in their own lives. You know,
They're bullies and cowards. And Dan, it is so profound when you make that distinction that you just did between the uniform and the person in it, and the fact that they confuse the reference with the referent. The fact that they are protecting and serving the rulers. They're not protecting and serving the public that they prey upon and the public that pays their salaries. Or in the United States, the public doesn't pay their salaries. My unborn grandchildren pay their salaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd like to switch gears a bit here, Bill. I didn't actually expect to be talking about police so quick, but what we really wanted to ask you is, we know that you've been a homeschooler, or home educator, should I say, and we'd just like to ask you, like to go into this. So, how did you decide to home educate your children?
What a great question. And I have to give all of the credit, 95% of the credit. I was simply the exchequer to my wife, who reared our 5 children. And we started home educating them after we had our oldest child in the government school for 2 months.
Yeah.
And as a result of a whole lot of dissatisfaction across the board, we saw that our children wouldn't be served for 2 reasons. Number one, the education would not be tailored to my individual child's needs. But number 2, and maybe more importantly, I would be surrendering my children. We as a family would be surrendering our children for up to 10 to 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, if not more on occasion, to these strangers whose only agenda is to create obedient subjects and not critically thinking citizens. So I guess those were the 2 reasons we started home education. My wife has been doing it now for, almost 22 years. We have our last son in the house, who is 17, of our 5 children, and I now have 6 because I have a daughter-in-law also. Of our children, he's the last one remaining, and he will leave probably next year. He's 17. He's been our most difficult child as far as home education is concerned, but we wouldn't go any other way.
Yeah, and I think that's important, like what you say about like other than surrendering them to people, because like to other people, as in, you know, them going to school, because I suppose that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there used to be a time when a lot of parents considered education to be a responsibility of theirs, but increasingly now people pretty much everyone I know just assumes that education is the responsibility of the state and it's not up to the parents.
And it's horrible, because Hitler said, "Give me your child to age 7 and I'll have him for life." And that's why you see this drive in the West. And I'll speak particularly, Dan and Katie, to America, if I may.
Yeah.
Where we see in America, they say, well, we need K-care, well, we need preschool. What they really want to do is they want to grab this child out of the womb, put it into some kind of government functioning system, and say, from this point onward, this child belongs to the state and not to you. Ultimately, that's their goal. And John Taylor Gatto and Brett at the School Sucks podcast.
Oh yeah, Brett Venot
has done some terrific stuff on that, and I highly recommend that. And I know you guys have listened to him, but those members of your audience who haven't listened to Brett's work at School Sucks is just terrific. It's so explanatory historically of what's driven America to become what it is today, and probably by extension, what's happened in the UK.
What I'd really like to ask you, as well, Bill, when you were home educating your children, as you have been over these years, I know you were saying it's really down to your wife, but if you could share with us sort of the methods that you found most effective when dealing with, obviously, 5 very different children.
Certainly, there's 7 different learning styles, and you have to identify in each individual human being what their particular learning style is.
Yeah.
For instance, there's a difference between my wife and I in our own individual learning styles and the way we approach the world. You know, I happen to be in Enneagram 5 or an INTJ, and she's much more extroverted than I am. I'm much more nerdy and prone to reading books and like being surrounded by books and having intellectual discussions and those things.
Yeah.
I have two children like that. My oldest son, who brought me to abolitionism, by the way, is it was terrific. He's a mechanical engineer. His wife is a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
He's currently in Salt Lake City. He has a master's, and he left with like a 3.9 or I think a 3.8 when he left. Now, other children, of course, have different things that happen.
Yeah.
My wife's assumed a number of different ways that she's done it. She's done unschooling. She's done the Charlotte Mason method, which is not text-based. She's done the trivium, the quadrivium. She's done classical conversations and homeschool co-ops where she gets together with other homeschoolers and they sort of pool their resources. So one may be good at mathematics, one may be good at chemistry, one may be good at reading, English, whatever the case may be. They pool their resources and they'll get together then. But for the most part, what you're trying to do with home education is you're taking the Mercedes-Benz of a learning style, which is one-on-one tutorship, and you're maximizing that for your, your own flesh and blood.
It's interesting you brought that up about, parents getting together kind of as a cooperative to teach the children different things. Because one of my questions for you was that I really wanted to touch on was the fact that some parents might feel overwhelmed at the idea of they sort of maybe it snowballs in their mind, as in, oh my gosh, I have to teach my child all this and this, and what did I learn at school? Oh my gosh, I can't remember. No, it's too easy. Just no, it's too hard. It's much easier just to send them to a state school. But do you think that there's like baby steps that you can take, perhaps maybe before you have children?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to start amassing a library. I had the homeschooling library of Alexandria before all of our children left. And we've sort of donated that and sold off parts of it, and now it's diminishing in size.
Oh, wow.
But here's the thing. Let's suppose that you and Dan have a particular skill set, but you're not so good at physics. You're not so good at chemistry.
Yeah.
What we did is we either found somebody in the community who would be in the cooperative with us, or we hired out a tutor.
Oh, yeah, of course. And private tutors are a big thing, yeah.
Exactly. And again, it's one-on-one, or maybe you have two other children who are home educating with, families similar to yours, and you guys pool your resources and say, for 20 quid an hour, quid's the correct term.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
For 20 quid an hour, you say, I'd like you to tutor these three children, not just one child. And this is what capitalism is all about. There's so many beauties to capitalism. But what capitalism is all about in voluntaryism is getting along with strangers in a nonviolent way and moving forward in civilization.
I love that.
And that's what you're doing.
Yeah, and because I can definitely speak for Dan. I'm sure he would agree. He's right here. Why am I not just? I'm sorry. I just take the. I'm sorry. But no, I think he would agree that I've completely lost my train of thought. I'm going to be brutally honest with you. That was funny, and I forgot where I was going. So Dan, you want to take over?
I know. We don't have kids yet, Bill, but we are really thinking about homeschooling. That's what we would like to do.
Home education.
Oh, sorry, home education. I keep doing it. Home education. But so that's something that we really want to do. So we're trying to sort of figure out, because there's so many different things. People talk about unschooling and sort of different methods.
The different methods, yeah.
And we're just, I know it'll probably be different for each child, but it's a bit daunting when you first start looking at it and you think, how are we going to figure all this out?
Well, you'll be able to figure it out. Not only are you guys most likely going to be good parents because you're voluntarists and you know what civilizational standards are, but who has the vested interest of your children in mind best and knows them more intimately? You or a stranger, especially a state stranger?
Yeah.
You do. Now, are there going to be fits and starts in doing this? Of course there are.
Yeah.
Are you going to make mistakes? Of course you are. But Thomas Jefferson, one of our luminaries in America, said that dangerous freedom is much better than peaceful slavery. And, here's the thing we have to get across to people too, Dan and Katie, is that we have a vision that is not utopian. Our vision is dystopian because
Yeah.
in our vision of a voluntarist, maybe a panarchist society, people are going to fail. People are going to stumble. People are going to get injured.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, people are going to get killed. But people will be the captains of their own destinies, and that's what counts the most.
Yeah, and I think it's important what you said there. Earlier on, I just remembered my point was you were saying about connecting with these people on a non-aggressive voluntary exchange, and I think met over the course of this last couple of months since we started the podcast, some of the nicest people I've ever met, and that's present company included. So it's very nice to be able to speak with people on that level, and if that's if I don't change the world, if that's what this brings and I get to speak to these people, then that's wonderful anyway. So why
Okay,
not?
let me tell you this though, Katie and Dan, what you are doing right now with this little modest podcast, as you think it is, you are philosophically terraforming the planet. That's what I'm doing. That's what you're doing. That's what we're all doing. We're doing that through example and showing people that there's another way. We're saying to people, forming a society around violence is morally wrong because there's an impossible moral equation that the state embraces, which is that immoral means can eventually equate to moral ends.
Yeah.
And that's never happened. It won't happen. And it won't ever happen in the future. But they keep doing it over and over and over again. I mean, this is where war comes from and all this. I think it's funny, too, that the hippies in America always said peace and love and all that, but the hippies are some of the biggest statists that we have in America. They're some of the biggest hypocrites when it comes, like the left. I find it abominable that the left, since 2008, with their man in power that they currently have, all their anti-war fervor just dissipated and disappeared.
Oh yeah, no. In fact, you were talking about Brett Bennett earlier, and I think it was when he was talking to you actually. He said that he remembers, when George Bush was in power, and the left were all anti-war, and then Obama gets into power, and then suddenly the left are for war, and everyone's like, I can't believe I fell for that.
I had this notion that I'm a non-voter, but I had this notion that when Obama was coming into office in 2008, he had made these promises. Well, how naive could I be? Made these promises that he would stop America making war in the world, which I would submit it's been doing since 1893. That he said we'd get out of the Middle East and we'd draw back and we'd finally take care of our own business at home. Well, of course, all that was prevarication and a lie, and none of that has happened. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that this is Bush's fourth term.
Oh yeah. And that's just so true, and I don't understand the left at all actually, because it seems like everything's been turned upside down, because you have obviously now that suddenly the left are all pro-war, and then even if you look at what we term the far right, there was a time in the previous century when the far right and sort of the Jews were poles apart, but now we see far-right protests in this country where they're walking about with Israel flags, and you're like, what's going on here?
Well, I think that's perfectly appropriate because Israel, of course, is a nation that is defined in war. It is birthed in war.
Yeah.
It is a nation on a war footing all the time with its neighbors, and much like their Palestinian problem is sort of like the Southern Irish problem and the Northern Ireland problem that the UK has had for the longest period of time. I mean, when you occupy a country for 800 years, in the case of Ireland, or when you occupy a territory, in this case, since 1948, or for the thousands of years previous, as some Arab scholars would tell us, you're going to create friction if you don't attempt to get along. For instance, are you aware that I think it's 92% of all the land in Israel is owned by the government?
Really? I was not aware of that, actually.
No.
It is, and of course, it makes both a pragmatic and a philosophical sense to do so. The philosophical sense is that they want it to remain Jewish. The pragmatic sense is that if they were to make it non-governmental land, then deed and title would be granted to the highest bidder. And of course, the Saudis have deep pockets. A lot of the Arab street has deep pockets. They would literally be able to purchase large tracts of Israel and give it to the Palestinians, Jordanians, or whatever Arab diaspora they chose to. So there's reason for that, but it doesn't excuse the misbehavior of the Israelis.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's one of these things, and you mentioned the sort of the conflict in Ireland, and obviously that's something that we know a lot about. And but it just seems sort of different in the way that it just seems to me like the Israel and Palestine thing. It seems like they're they're just the only way out of it is to annihilate each other or something, because I know the Ireland thing hasn't been completely put to bed, but it's completely different. I even remember in the 1990s going there on holidays to visit family, and there being soldiers and checkpoints everywhere, and that doesn't exist anymore in Ireland.
Well, it's interesting. I've been a student of the Irish Rebellion for the longest time because my specialty when I was in uniform and even afterwards, I finished my master's degree in asymmetrical warfare last year, which is
Wow.
irregular warfare. It is that it's one of the only irregular conflicts in the Western Hemisphere that is Anglophone. So all the primary source and secondary source documentation, either revelations of actual fighters, observers of fighters, contemporaries at the time during this 800 years, or since the Irish Rising in 1916, it's all in English. So for scholars to be able to look at that and not have to command another language, it's terrific. But it isn't paid a lot of attention to in America, and people are abysmally ignorant of the Irish Rebellion and irregular warfare that's taken over. And also they're abysmally ignorant, I think, and you guys are probably more savvy about it, of how it has helped to justify the United Kingdom in erecting the police and surveillance state that they have. Because they've got a number of terror acts. I think that one of the reasons that they disarmed you was because of what happened in Dunblane,
Yeah,
where
that's
Yeah, it
when
did.
as a result of one, and it makes me barking mad because I think to myself, what you're telling me is you're saying that in order to protect me or Dan or Katie from a few bad people, you want me to put the worst people in charge of every aspect of my life. The equation doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and
You're
I
right.
mean, we've been vocal, well, I have more than Katie, about gun ownership. And see, pretty much everybody I talk to, when I mention, oh yeah, I think guns should be legal, they think I'm crazy. And even when I say to them, well, what, so we just let the government have the monopoly of violence here? We should be allowed to surely protect ourselves. And people think that I'm insane, because I want to be able to defend myself with a firearm.
Well, I'm so glad that you bring that up there because you are truly, I mean, sort of like being in California in America, you are truly behind enemy lines when it comes to private weapons ownership and the right to defend yourself. I'd like to revisit something you said a few minutes ago, if I may,
Yeah.
Dan,
Yeah.
concerning the right. I I've dispensed with using right left as a descriptive spectrum of interventionism. I use the terms collectivism and interventionism, and what you
Yeah.
find is
Yeah.
that, for instance, here in America, our Republican Party and our Democrat Party are both collectivist interventionist organizations. Over there, when you have the Labor Party and you have your Tory Party and you have your right wing and then you have your UKIP and you have
Yeah.
these other parties, for the most part, with the exception of that tiny libertarian sliver that you have,
Yeah.
Yeah.
your country is a collectivist interventionist country, the
Yep.
highest order. I think, if I'm correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the UK has 25% of all the world's CCTV assets.
I believe that's true, actually. I think I read that in Big Brother Watch.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just incredible. I mean, what you guys are experiencing there in the UK is a harbinger of things to come here in these United States, and part of that is because of George Bernard Shaw and the Fabian Socialists at the turn of the 20th century,
Mm.
who so
Mhm.
influenced,
Oh,
all of the British politics there, where there really is no sizable representation of the thought that you guys embrace,
No, there really
especially in the
isn't.
public sphere.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and you mentioned the political parties. There's an MP over here as a sort of radical MP called George Galloway, and we have now it's the Labour Party, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats are the three big ones, and he always describes it. He says, if if a if an arse could have three cheeks, they would be three cheeks of the one arse, basically.
That's hilarious. And we, of course, our entire politics is an arse over here in the
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah.
So that's just the way it goes.
But this actually leads us nicely into what I was going to speak about was there's this big Scottish independence referendum going on, and I've made the case about, well, so many times about they're calling it independence, right? But they want to remain, they want to keep the pound, so they want to remain and hawk to the Bank of England. They want to retain EU membership, and they want to retain the monarch as head of state. And I try to keep telling people that's not independence. None of that is independence. It's just more power for Scotland, and let's just keep the same old power structure in place.
Well, I agree with you 100%. What baffles me the most, and maybe you can give me some insight on this, is that if and if you've watched any of my stuff or read any of my stuff, I was the keynote speaker on secession at Porkfest. I think it was in 2012, where that was what I talked about, was secession. I think that secession is the rule and not the exception throughout historical times in the West of how nation states rise, how they decay, how they eventually go away, and then something comes in its place. What baffles me, though, is that from my reading of it, if Scotland were to become its own country, especially with what you just mentioned, what it wants to do, it would be nothing more than a tiny USSR enclave on the British Isles.
Oh, yeah. Exactly, because the problem is as well, a lot of people in Scotland are very socialistic. So apart from the official Yes for Independence campaign, you have a thing called the Radical Independence campaign. And I've wrote loads of articles about this because basically they just want bigger government, bigger welfare state, more handouts. And it's like they're coming up and they're saying, right, government's the problem, so how do we solve it? We have more government, that'll solve it. And I'm trying to say to everyone, no, you have no government. That's the only way you solve it.
Dan, I am so happy you guys are in Scotland fighting the good fight. Manker Olson said that roving bandits become government once they become stationary bandits. And one of the phrases I saw recently here that really struck a chord with me, and maybe it'll strike a chord with you and your audience, is that so you want me to pay for your own health care. What's to stop you from having me pick your cotton?
Well, it's essentially the same thing. You know, I have to do it. You are coercing me to do it. So, you know, there really is no difference.
And healthcare here is insane. I mean, the NHS is it's been described as a national religion in the UK. You know, and that, honestly, I'm not even joking. And if any party dares to even mention cutting it slightly, you wouldn't believe the uproar.
Oh, I have no doubt of it. You know, the apocryphal story I use here as a comparison with our imposition of National Socialist healthcare and Obamacare in America is that in the 1930s, let's suppose FDR, who I consider one of the most venal, opportunistic, and criminal presidents in the Oval Office, and that's saying a lot. What if he were to say, you know what, food is so important, from farm to delivery to warehousing, purchase, everything, we're going to nationalize it. We're going to have ABC grocery stores in America. So now, all of a sudden, we fast forward to 2014. I'm talking to my friends in Scotland about how bad the food is here in America because the government provisions it. Yeah. And then there's some wacky people like myself or others who say, you know what, why don't we let the free market take over the provision of groceries? Maybe they could have unique names like Safeway or Publix or Fry's or something like that. And they could use price as a way to rationally allocate, because price is the supreme signal for knowing whether you're making too much of something or too little of something.
Exactly.
There's no better system ever in human history that determines the rational allocation of resources. Now, if I did that, though, and we had ABC grocery stores, I would suffer the same umbrage that you just described, Dan, where people would look at me as if I had an organ growing out of my forehead.
You know, it's interesting when we're talking about healthcare.
You tried to get private healthcare. You looked into it in this
country? I did. I went on to a price comparison site, a rating site, which I'm a fan of. And it basically, I typed in, you know, private healthcare, and I ticked all the boxes that I needed to tick. And I looked at it, and it was actually quite reasonable. And I turned to Dan, I said, you know, if we're going to be living more ethically, you know, maybe we should do this. And we were looking, and I noticed in small print that it says that this private healthcare is not to be used as a, what's the word?
It's only a supplement to the NHS healthcare. It's not complete. They only do certain things for you. So basically, there's no way you can opt out of the NHS completely.
You can't.
It astonishes me, and I just wanted to make note of the fact that you said this is the ethical thing to do, and you were looking to take out money out of your own limited resources so
Yeah.
that you could do that very thing. And I think that's part of what makes the libertarian, voluntarist, anarchist, abolitionist movement so powerful. Because you guys, if you have you've been on my website, of course. Have you seen on
Of
my
course.
banner where it reads Wilberforce?
Yes, yes, we have.
Of course, you know who that is. William
I was going to
Wilberforce.
say William Wilberforce. Yeah, I was just checking. I got it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, if there is any heartland of the origination in the West of somebody standing up and saying the ownership of other human beings is morally wrong, and he's laughed at
Yeah.
from both sides of the aisle, yet it turns out that William Wilberforce is right. I mean, you guys are at ground zero, philosophical ground zero.
Yeah, yeah, we are.
Yeah, totally. And also, while we're obviously talking about like Scotland and independence and stuff, I wanted to make this point because what we've been told recently is, oh yeah, like we're going to write a Scottish constitution and that's going to make everything fine. You know, we'll just and they actually want to write the NHS into the constitution. Don't get me
Yeah.
started on that. But I've noticed you've said a lot about the US constitution, and I actually wrote an article. Using some of Lysander Spooner's arguments from No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, to back
Excellent.
up why a Scottish constitution won't do anything for anyone.
And it won't do anything for you know, you've read my stuff apparently, and
Yeah.
you've listened to my talks. I am not a constitutionalist by any stretch. As a matter of fact, in 2010, I was at Freedom Fest and I debated Dr. Daniel Walker Howe from UCLA on the superiority of the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. I think it's disappeared down the memory hole because evidence of that video and audio debate are nowhere to be found unless somebody in my audience can find it.
Oh,
But I think that I pretty handily slapped him down both academically and philosophically because in the end, what the Constitution has done, and Spooner says this, and I'm paraphrasing, if the Constitution is the reason we have such big government, or if it is incapable of stopping this from happening, what use is it for liberty and freedom in either way?
yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting when we're talking, because when we're talking about all this, we're talking about a Scottish constitution and all the things like that. We can actually take it right back to the issue of education and educating our children, because the SNP, part of their Yes campaign, is offering free preschool free preschool. So from the age of 3 or 4, free preschool for every child in the country. And I'm not making that up. You can check that
Katie,
out.
it's diabolical. It really is. When it looks all friendly and huggy,
Yeah.
but in the end, when you take away the patriotic bunting and you look at why they're doing that, they want to do that so they can get their tentacles into the tender brain matter of the young people and turn them into statist automatons.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at now.
Yeah, and we worry that an independent Scotland. A lot of people talk about the Nordic model in this country, and people like us, Bill, we know that that's not a good thing. I know it's talked about in the US as well. We know that is just one step away from, well, it's kind of communism in a way, but like that's what we worry. Then it might end up sort of like Sweden, and then homeschooling might become illegal as it is in Sweden, and then we would have to move, man.
Well, if you did, we have room for you here, or
Hey.
other expatting opportunities may emerge because we're looking to possibly expat from the United States because I have a dim outlook for freedom and liberty in the States.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to get any better.
Yeah.
Really, do you not think, I know like obviously mainstream wise, but do you not think there's becoming quite an undercurrent of young people now that are really getting involved in sort of libertarianism and sort of anarchist ideas? Because I know I'm only seeing kind of snapshots and podcasts and stuff, but it seems to me like there might be something starting up.
Well, I do think that it's there, but it certainly isn't in the numbers that would be necessary to make a sea change happen philosophically in these United States. But one thing you can keep in mind is that it takes 3% of a given population to really make it change in either a negative or a positive way. A negative way would be what happened in the USSR, well, in Russia in 1918 and Mexico at the same time. And then the other thing would be in the first American Revolution, the second one starting in 1860. In the first American Revolution, when we started our divorce proceedings with the United Kingdom, it was 3% of the population, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Washington and Hamilton to a lesser extent because they were evil opportunists, both of them. They were able to philosophically change, Paul Revere included, philosophically change the outlook where the colonials started to see themselves more as an independent entity that needed to secede and establish its own national identity instead of becoming a Commonwealth nation. You know, you were talking a few minutes ago, it was very interesting to me. We have something called Five Eyes in America, which is New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Australia, and the US,
Right.
where it's sort of like this Anglophone nation-state conclave that are more equal than others when it comes to military and political matters.
Yeah.
I get the sense from what you're describing that Scotland, if it were to divorce from the United Kingdom, would want to be a Commonwealth nation. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would
Yeah, it would.
absolutely keep the monarchy as the Queen as head of state and all that. That would be part of it.
That's craziness.
Yeah, it's insanity. People have the Stockholm syndrome in Britain about the royal family.
How interesting that you use the term Stockholm syndrome, because I use that often too myself, Dan, to describe what people do who aren't voluntarists, because it's sort of like an odd amalgam or combination between the Stockholm syndrome and the Milgram and Stanford experiments.
Oh, yeah.
Where that's what we do here. You know, I hope you don't take umbrage at me saying this, but unfortunately I think that at the Battle of Culloden, that's when the Scots became English poodles.
Yeah, I don't take umbrage to this, so it's okay.
Okay.
I'll let you off. But it's interesting, Bill, because we're talking about like strategy and stuff. Well, not strategy, but I mean like how I was saying, I noticed there is a kind of undercurrent of young people taking up libertarianism and things like that. And what I kind of think is, you talked about the Fabians earlier, and the Fabians have a very gradualist approach towards everything. You know, it seems to me the elites have been thinking long term for a long time, and a lot of people in other movements have thought, I want to see this in my lifetime, you know, so we need to do this. And then when they get old, they become disillusioned because it hasn't happened. But I think now there's a lot of young people who understand like the philosophy of liberty and freedom, who are starting to think like the elites. They're starting to think, I might not see it in my lifetime, but it is definitely worth me spreading it about, and because then future generations, it could take root in a big way.
Well, I agree with everything that you just said, and I think that, you know, it's sort of like this. Maybe that's the long-term philosophical terraforming and seeding that podcasts like yours and like Brett's are doing. And then, per what you were saying about the Fabians and their gradualist process, John Taylor Gatto, and I think it was like a 5-hour video that Brett did with John Taylor Gatto, because the man is really he's shuffling towards death's door, unfortunately. I think he's a national treasure.
Yeah, oh yeah.
When he shuffles off this mortal coil, we're all going to be at a loss. But it was 5 hours of video and maybe 14 hours of audio that Richard Grove got. That's who it is. Brett has interviewed Taylor Gatto, but not to the extent that Richard has.
Yeah.
And so Richard's got this like 19 hours of John Taylor Gatto showing us line by line and step by step how this sort of Fabian ambition has taken root, taken hold, and has been a long-term project. But look at the rewards that they've gotten as a result of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's unbelievable. But I think it's a good thing now that we're starting to actually see this for what it is, because I think people like us have been way behind for a long time, you know, because they've been just implementing this gradualist process for years and years, and we haven't even noticed until it was too late. You know?
Well, I don't think it's ever too late if we can become aware. You know, it's like William Comer said, we're living in a sick society that's filled with people who would not directly steal from their neighbor, but who are willing to demand that the government do it for them.
Oh, yeah.
That's what the state comes down to. That's what it is, because the state is, of course, based on theft and violence. I'm not a Christian, but I'm not an atheist either. But I find that government can't exist unless it violates the Ten Commandments. And I don't have a lot of disagreement with the Ten Commandments. I think that if those are the 10 edicts one uses to form a society, that's pretty darn good from a voluntarist perspective. But the government has to violate those 10 commandments to do what it does.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still crazy how many people we speak to, and they think that government is this thing that we need to have. And I suppose I think it was Larkin Rose one time, he said if I could have gone back and spoke to myself like 10 years ago when I was a statist, I don't know what I would have said to me then to make me an anarchist. Like, it just sort of happened gradually, you know?
Well, I have to say, Dan, one of the nuclear options that I employ in these rhetorical crossing of swords that we do with collectivists, maybe on a daily or a weekly basis, is I look at them soberly and seriously and without screaming or yelling or getting excited and saying, the reason I cannot, especially leftist, but I find conservatives in America are just as horrible, especially with what one would call a leftist and a collectivist. I can't sign on to your philosophical precepts because I can't advocate the initiation of force or violence. Therefore, I can't agree with you in any way.
Yeah, and it's so strange as well, because we were talking about the police and stuff, and when I put it in terms of, you know, if I don't pay the government because, you know, what they're forcing me to, then someone will kidnap me and put me in a cage. And then loads of people say to me, they go, oh, they're not kidnapping you, they're arresting you. And I'm like, well, define kidnapping to me and explain why it's any different.
Dan, it's so valuable to take the language and parse it as specifically as you and Katie are doing, because, for instance, I use the term government education. And we have this thing in the United States where people say, and this shows you how linguistics speaks to the formation of our very thinking with us without us consciously knowing it. In the United States, we use this curious grammatical construction that says the United States is. We don't say these United States are, which is contemporary to the lexicon of the founding of what is presently the USA. When you say the United States is, and you make that presumption, you make that assumption that it's this unitary, centrally planned, top-down organization. People assume that's the way it is. But if you say these United States are, that makes secession more vital. That makes the 10th Amendment more vital. It makes these notions of smaller pieces instead of larger wholes being more important to liberty and freedom.
And language is so important, isn't it? Because, like, we know stuff about his name escapes me, it will come back to me. But, you know, Sigmund Freud's nephew wrote Propaganda.
I don't know.
It'll come back to me. But, like, Edward Bernays, that's what it is, yeah. And he was instrumental in, for example, changing the Ministry of War to the Ministry of Defence. And then we have stuff like in 1984, obviously by George Orwell, and they were doing Newspeak, the government, so if you didn't have a word for revolution, then how could anyone know what it was?
Exactly. Thanks to George Orwell for doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to that. George Orwell, surprisingly enough, who I think remained a socialist for most of his life, but he was a sober socialist. Like we had a guy named Alexander Coburn who wrote for The Nation magazine, which is a collectivist rag in America, a column called Beat the Devil. But the great thing about Alexander Coburn is, even though he professed himself to be a man of the left and a collectivist and such, is that he would throw barbs in that direction if he had to. He would show the warts and barnacles that were on the good ship collectivism whenever he saw fit, because whether right, left, collectivist, interventionist, whatever the case may be, they tend not to cast aspersions at their own house of disorder and ill repute as much as they do other people, sort of like that othering thing where they, you know, that person's the other, it's us versus them, that kind of mentality. That kind of mentality, of course, which the state feeds upon to make sure that people conflict with each other instead of get along with each other.
Oh yeah, classic divide and rule, yeah. And Orwell did actually, yeah, he remained a socialist. But I'm a big Orwell fan, but one of the things he did say, though, he always called himself a democratic socialist, but his thing was, he did once say that the only real divide is between authoritarians and libertarians. So he really understood that totalitarianism was a bad thing, but I don't know, but he still kept the socialist ideology.
Which baffles me, because I find collectivism to be a form of intellectual drunkenness to a certain extent.
Oh yeah.
But if you look at this with any kind of sober inquiry, you discover that violence is the handmaiden to the state. And if violence is the way you form your society, you will reap what you sow over the short term and the long term.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's another thing I wanted to get into, Bill, and I really wanted to talk to you about this, and it's something that I'm very interested in because I notice you describe yourself as a Stoic.
I am a Stoic.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because you don't. I like a bit of philosophy myself. Well, what do you mean for our listeners when you say I'm a Stoic? Like, what is Stoicism to you?
Well, Stoicism is it's an ancient philosophy that started in Greece. It's approximately 2,500 years old. Some of the people you may be familiar with who practiced it, and there are probably dozens of them in the school of Stoic thought and philosophy, is Seneca,
Yeah.
Epictetus, and of course, most famously, Marcus Aurelius, who was not only a Roman emperor, but the author of Meditations. Now, of course, like all of us, Aurelius was a bundle of contradictions because how can you be a Roman emperor and, in my mind, a Stoic at the same time? Because Stoicism is very interesting in several regards. Number one, it's about span of control. Number two, it's about living a joyful life in which your consciousness, your conscience, and your moral compass is measured by your own behavior on your own, regardless of what anybody else thinks. And that, for the most part, what I found as almost a steady stream from Stoicism to Neo-Stoicism is a variation on the Hippocratic oath of do no harm that pretty much seems to be the sine qua non of Stoic philosophy. But it takes on, I think, an even more important aspect. I think there's a linkage between libertarianism, voluntaryism, abolitionism, and anarchism with Stoicism, because to me, besides cats, who I think are nature's natural anarchist, I find that the Stoics are probably the most natural occurring adjunct of voluntarism and abolitionism in the history of Western thought. If we're looking for the purest, maybe even fount of where this came from, maybe even unconsciously, Stoicism would be where that's at. There is a collection of extant writings of Stoicism, about 600, 650 pages long, that one can find either you guys or members of your audience on Amazon or maybe a local bookstore there
We can
in the
definitely
UK.
we can definitely link something up to the bottom of the show.
And what
Yeah.
I'll do is I'll send you some links via email.
Oh, thank you,
If
thank
you don't
you.
mind.
Sure,
And
sure, of
then you
course.
could do that. There's a modern introduction to Stoicism I highly recommend. And of course, I recommend Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
Mhm.
Whenever my children left the house, not only would they leave with a rifle and pistol, they would also leave with a copy of Meditations.
That's great. I love that.
So, so I think Stoicism is a means by which. Well, let me give you this apocryphal story, and I'll paraphrase it.
Okay.
One of the Roman emperors comes to a Stoic philosopher. He says, "I demand you come to my royal court." And he says, "I'll think about it." I'm putting this in modern argot so that everybody can understand it.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So the Stoic philosopher says, "I'll think about it." He says, "I'll command my praetorians to come and fetch you." He says, "You can do that, but I may not comply with you." He says, "Well, then I'll bring your corpse to my court." And he says, "You may do that, but," as Michael Collins would tell us from that famous movie where Liam Neeson played, he said,
Yes.
"You can put us in chains and you can send us to the Marne, but you can have my refusal, and that's what you'll get."
Yeah.
In essence, when you think about it, what the Stoics said to all of us is that your compliance and your refusal is up to you as an individual. And of course, Gandhi riffed off of that. I wrote this. I know I'm all over the place, and please excuse me for that.
No, you're okay.
That's the way we like it.
But I wrote this essay several months ago called "Question Obedience" because I thought question authority is really sexy, and maybe it'll get you laid in hippie circles and things like that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
But you don't have to do anything about it. You can flap your gums about it. What you really need to do to make the rubber hit the road and put your mouth where your myths are is say question obedience, much like David Thoreau did, much like Michael Collins did, much like the Stoics did, much like that Stoic did when he was asked by the Roman emperor to come to his court. And he said, "Well, in the end, if I don't wish to come and you wish to fetch me and you wish to kill me, you'll have my corpse, but you won't have my compliance and you'll have all of my refusal." I just think there's an interesting linkage there between all of this about voluntarism and questioning obedience and the place of the individual against the state. And Stoicism speaks to me philosophically, and it also speaks to this whole oeuvre that we entertain as a philosophy. I'm writing a book on this, as a matter of fact, next year on the connection between Stoicism and libertarianism. I'm writing 2 books this year. One is a novel, which I'm having a really hard time writing fiction. I thought it would be easy, but it's not. Yeah. And then the other book is taking all 6 volumes of Lysander Spooner's 2,600 pages and elucidating that and analyzing it in 1 volume for people to access.
See, I think that's great because, I mean, Spooner, I've only read a few of Spooner's books, but he's been a massive influence on me.
He's huge.
Oh, yes.
He's the patron saint of my site.
And he should be. That's great. Because, see, when I read Vices Not Crimes, I mean, what better argument do you have even now for like things like drug legalization, prostitution legalization? You know, you just basically, vices aren't crimes. You know, that's the only way to say it, really.
You know, may I suggest too that, again, we're speaking language, and the 3 of us practice language specificity. When it comes to drugs, for instance, we need to ridicule what the state does. I don't embrace legalization in the slightest. I embrace decriminalization because I want to see it taken off the books entirely. So I never employed the term legalization. And also think about what the drug war is, and it's been very, very lucrative for the police military industrial complex here in America. Because what the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has done here in America is they've used the drug war to make transparent every human behavior and transaction that takes place in the United States. But I think the worst part of it is that when we look at that, it's a war against your ability to alter your own consciousness. And it's a war basically that's silly because it's a war against illegal vegetation.
I know, like against things that grow in your garden.
Yeah.
It's insanity, and but you're right. I got to be on my toes with you, man, because you're pulling me up about my language everywhere.
Well, I don't mean to be a bother.
No, not at all.
No, you're fine. Don't worry.
As the premier philosophical terraformers of planet Earth, it's our responsibility to practice that kind of specificity.
No, I think you're right, and yeah, the decriminalization thing, you're right, because I mean, I still understand why like the UK hasn't even learned their lesson. I mean, the UK are so against, like, for example, even decriminalizing marijuana, but I mean, it's not legal in Amsterdam, it's decriminalized, and we've been to Amsterdam, you know, despite all the things that are legal there, and guess what? It's a really safe, nice place to be, you know, and we're only an hour's flight away, and it seems like we can't learn our lesson in this country.
Well, I'm at a greater risk in the US of being assaulted by our police forces than, well, let me put it this way. I stand a better chance of being eaten by a great white, struck by lightning twice at the same time than suffering a foreign-born terrorist attack on American soil. But I stand a much greater chance of being kidnapped, caged, maimed, or killed, depending on my level of resistance, by our constabulary forces in the U.S.
That's scary.
It is.
It's really
I think you suffer the same in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the fact that people still can't see this as an evil and just like, I mean, how is the government any different than the mafia? You know, it's not. It's just the same thing, but
they're stationary bandits.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think
it's like organized crime.
Yeah, and I see, you know, one of the things I've been looking at is with this independence debate going on in Scotland right now, I see a lot of people that are saying that they're yes voters, they want independence, and you should see some of them are really, really full of life, and they're screaming about freedom and yes, and we won't live under this tyranny anymore, and I can see in them the absolute potential to be voluntarists. I think if they took a day out of their schedule just to sort of go online and go on our resources page and go onto your website and to see what all these things are, and then maybe we could have a chance to get some real numbers going. But you know,
yeah, because see if we could harness the power that these people put into stuff like that, and even stuff into football games on a Saturday afternoon, you know, if they would put that power into actually freeing themselves, you know, it'd be half the battle.
Well, look, my hat's off to you, because what you've done is through the podcast medium, and what you guys are doing right now, this is powerful, because not as many people read today as they read 40 years ago, 100 years ago. This is the medium that young people tend to gravitate to, is the very thing that you're doing. And what's great about your podcast is not only because I've been too lazy to do it, but I've been thinking about doing my own audio podcast.
Oh, sure.
Audio podcasts can be put into into an Apple product or a Microsoft product, whatever the case may be. And on your commute, they listen to it. While they're at the gym, they listen to it, whatever the case may be. So I think what you guys are doing, providing that resource page, is terrific. And of course, I would love people to read my blog, but I think with the medium that you're using here, you're going to reach a far greater number of young people than I would say, hey, you need to read Lysander Spooner's No Treason. You need to read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Oh, yeah. And by the way, if you've got a month and no time to work, you need to read Von Mises' Human Action and Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard. But people don't have the time nor the inclination. So I think the cutting edge to get voluntaryism into the mainstream or get it into the mainstream consciousness is what you and Dan are doing.
It's funny you talk about people like if you have a month to read a book, you don't have to go to work or do anything that everybody does have to do. And it's funny because Dan and I both we both have jobs that keep us busy from morning till night. We just happen to be off this week, which is great. But no, we are usually working 9 till 6, and Dan works.
But I have the luxury of being able to listen to podcasts and audiobooks while I work. So.
Yeah, and
that's excellent.
And I did it on my way to work. I put books on on audio on my MP3 player, and I just go on the bus and I can learn, and it's great. And it's right that people with all this at our fingertips, we're watching videos of dogs on YouTube. I just don't understand.
Ignorance is a choice now.
I've said this on other broadcasts. We are at a time in humanity's progression and evolution where vertically and horizontally we have access to more information and data than anybody, probably combined, who ever succeeded us in previous generations had. And like Katie just said, people are worried about if their toast was burned, how was their date last night, whatever the case may be. We have access to all this information that if we put all these jigsaw puzzle pieces in the right way and we're philosophically cognizant of the direction we wanted to head, all the tools we need to do that are before our eyes and ears right now. But it's not being done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bill, we'll start to wrap up now, and this has been great, and thanks so much for coming on.
I'm honored by the invitation, and thank you so much.
But Bill, why don't you tell us about your book and your website for our listeners?
I'll do that. My book was published in 2012, and it was a compilation of my essays, and it's on Amazon Kindle. It's only available electronically. I chose to go that route because I think that Amazon Kindle electronic books is revolutionizing the publishing industry. And we hear from a lot of the collectivists, especially the ones who profess to be lefties, they say, we need to democratize everything. Well, if anything has democratized the knowledge revolution, ebooks have done that. I price it at $2.99. Sometimes I'll have it for free. If I priced it at $19.99 because I was a greedy and evil capitalist, I wouldn't sell very many.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about this is that, like Malcolm Gladwell says, the cool thing about books is that not only do you have the street cred to say you're a published author, but it gets you speaking engagements and speaking gigs. Yeah. And speaking gigs for authors, unless I'm like Stephen King, which I don't anticipate having that kind of profligacy when it comes to writing. Yeah. Speaking is where you can make a little bit of money or you can get the word out, whatever the case may be. And my blog, I've been maintaining that since 2009. I wrote on Lou Rockwell since 2003. I try to publish new stuff. I always get this confused, bi-weekly, semi-weekly. Twice a week. I'm going to say twice a week. That sounds better. Yeah, even though fortnightly was... So 4 times fortnightly. Maybe your audience would understand that.
I don't know. I'm lost.
So I try to publish new stuff, and I also do 10-question interviews with folks. And I've had some interesting ones of late with Brian Burkhart of Fatal Encounters and Bill Scott, whose son Eric Scott was gunned down by the Las Vegas Metro PD in 2010 at Costco for various reasons. And people can go to my website and read that. Unfortunately, while I do like to speak to liberty and all that stuff, I found that 1/3 of my time, if not more, when it comes to my blog postings, discussions, things like that, is spent dealing with the cop epidemic, the paramilitary violence epidemic that is visited upon people universally in America. Because when you think about it, Cops are the existential threat to liberty for this one very good reason. Name your political bad actor. It could be Gordon. It could be Gladstone. It could be Disraeli. It could be Robert the Bruce. It could be Obama. It could be George Bush.
Yeah.
It could be Michael Collins. Whoever that is. If they assume the mantle of the state, the only way they can deprive any single individual of their freedom and liberty is through police forces, police enforcement, and police action. That's the only way it can be done. If we look at it in Western history, that's the way it is. And that's what we face right now in the West, is this paramilitary police state that in America it's evolved into almost a security services conclave for the government, in which it does its bidding. They don't protect and serve the communities they're in. They protect and serve the rulers and paymasters who provide them with their lucrative salaries and pensions and great equipment that they use on a daily basis, as we're seeing in Ferguson, Missouri. And lastly, I'd like to urge everybody who gets a chance to come to my forum, which you can find a forum tab on my ZeroGov blog site, which is zerogov.com, and join the conversation there. We believe that sacred cows make the best burgers. So as long as you're gentlemanly and not boorish, we love all conversation, especially if that conversation challenges the voluntarist meme.
Well, we are going to check that out for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, Bill. And thanks everyone for listening. As always, for more libertarian podcast ratings and news, visit greeningoutpodcast.co.uk.
And thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Well, it was great, and I hope to talk to you guys some more, either via email or the phone.
That's great. Thank you, Bill.